welcome to episode 175 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I am here with
Andrew Swafford,
Lydia Creech,
Nathan Smith.
And in today's episode, we will be talking about movies we saw this week in part 1, and in part 2, we will be reflecting on 2017, but not with 2017 releases, but movies that were released in the past.
In the past.
That we really enjoyed. In the past, that we enjoyed this year. So non-2017 releases that we enjoyed this year.
We're calling it 2017 Discoveries.
That works too.
First time favorites.
First time favorites. There we go.
So some behind the scenes for our listeners.
All right. First time favorites. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into part 1. We have 2 new releases we're going to talk about. The first one made $500 million this past weekend, and it is the Star Wars The Last Jedi. James Franco really wishes it made $500 million. Star Wars The Last Jedi, the latest in this new trilogy of Star Wars films. This one is written and directed by Rian Johnson of Looper and Brothers Bloom fame, and it picks up right where The Force Awakens left off, with Rey meeting up with a secluded Luke Skywalker to hone her newfound abilities and try to bring the Jedi back to power, and Oscar Isaac and Carrie Fisher and John Boyega fighting the First Order, or the latest iteration of space Nazis. I think that's about the gist of this movie. So Nathan, what did you think of Star Wars The Last Jedi?
So, first matter of business, how much are we revealing?
It just came out.
In this.
Let's go little spoilers, and then we can ring the gong and do spoilers after a while.
So, I was not a fan of The Force Awakens. I assume that most people who are dedicated listeners of the podcast probably know that I am a lifelong defender of the prequels and big fan of George Lucas, and I feel like these movies really lack something without him. That being said, I do think that this movie is definitely better than The Force Awakens. J.J. Abrams is not really a director of images. The Force Awakens was really more of an actor and character showcase, in my opinion. Rian Johnson does have a much better sense of composition and of color and all those things, and there's a much better sense of kind of rhythm and of editing in this movie, which was something I felt like The Force Awakens really lacked. And I also feel like it's much more concerned with kind of the larger edges of the universe, which is what I really like about the prequels, is that there's so many background details, there's so many characters and just things that are not the focus necessarily of the main narrative, but that are there and that are interesting and that catch your eye. And this movie had a lot more of those things. That being said, it is pretty long. I mean, most Star Wars movies are kind of long, but there were a lot of moments that dragged for me, and I feel like it tries to tell way too many stories, which is maybe less symptomatic of like its own condition and quality as a movie, and more just symptomatic of blockbusters in general, where you have this really big ensemble and it's just kind of like jumping back and forth very quickly between all of these different subplots. And I've seen a lot of people comparing this to The Empire Strikes Back. I mean, it's a lot darker than The Force Awakens, much more of a serious movie. But I feel like what Empire has that this doesn't is that it spends a lot more time with each storyline. I mean, maybe that makes the experience of the movie feel a little bit slower, but like when you're on Dagobah with Luke and Yoda, you are on Dagobah. When you're in space with Han and Leia and everybody else and the romance is building, you are with them. And it does move back and forth between those plot lines in Empire, but I felt like The Last Jedi, to its detriment, was just trying to tell so many stories, to the point where it's like I don't really still have a sense of who some of these characters are. Like, Poe was hardly in The Force Awakens, and I still don't really know who he is as a person. Even Rey, I don't really feel like I know who she is as a person. And I think some of the new characters, like Laura Dern, there's so little information given about her. I mean, to my understanding, there's apparently more in the expanded universe materials that exist and that have been leading up to this movie. But I think that's a really unreasonable expectation to expect people to be really familiar with that stuff. And I think the only reason why her character works at all is just because Laura Dern is such a great actress and has that kind of like immediate presence, like Alec Guinness did in the original trilogy, where this person just shows up and is like such a great screen presence that you immediately sort of figure out their character and who they are. But as far as like information, there's not a whole lot, and I feel like it kind of wastes her and wastes some of the other talent in the movie. But I did like it more than The Force Awakens. I think there's some out there stuff, like it gets pretty weird with how it uses the Force, and I kind of like that it's pushing the boundaries a little bit. Zach, what were your thoughts?
I wanna start with the point that you just made, that you liked kind of where it was going with the idea of the Force, because that was one of the things I really liked about this movie, was that it really dug into this concept of the Force as this, you know, kind of religious entity that, you know, I feel like a lot of what the Force has been for most of the Star Wars time has been kind of just this superpower, this, you know, you can shock people, you can choke people, you can push people, you can lift planes, you know. But I loved how in The Last Jedi they really focused on it being this almost you know, meditative state, this like you're entering this ethereal plane that it just seemed like this whole, you know, outside thing that you had to kind of tap into, rather than it being just this cool power upgrade. It seemed less like a video game feature and more like something that was more substantial, more meaningful. I'm hoping that they'll continue that in the third movie. Probably not, because J.J. Abrams is taking back over. But I really like that. I liked The Last Jedi. I thought The Force Awakens was fine. Its main function was to reignite the franchise by one, reintroducing it to old characters now in a much, you know, older state, but also introducing this new band of characters that we're supposed to be following through this new trilogy. And it's not a perfect movie, and it's to its, you know, detriment and its and all of the positive features, it is a ripoff of A New Hope. But I think that's kind of what it was supposed to be. Like, it just, there wasn't anything else it was supposed to be. It did exactly what it needed to do, whether that's good or bad. Rogue One, while that's not tied to this trilogy as a whole, I think you can go back and listen to Nathan, you and I talking about that one on a previous episode from last year. But I like this one. It's bloated. It's messy. It doesn't necessarily cohesively go together well at times, but it makes kind of some questionable things, or at least not things, but choices in terms of like what characters do. There's a moment with General Leia early on in the movie where something happens to her, and it's a little bit strange, I guess. Like, a quick, you know, spoiler tag. You know, bing dong, whatever, ring the spoiler gong. A bullet hits the ship that she's in and sucks her and all the people on this in this area of the ship into space, and she's like kind of floating into space and crystallizing, and it looks like she's gonna die. And that was kind of traumatic because Carrie Fisher, you know, of course, passed away this year, and that was a really sad thing. So I was like, is this gonna be the moment? Like, is this how they're gonna take her out of the Star Wars universe? Because that's deeply, deeply traumatic for just people watching this. But then she, you know, summons this, you know, force ability to, and she just kind of floats back into the ship, and it's incredibly hokey. But but yeah, well, that's what I kind of loved it because, like I said, like we lost Carrie Fisher this year, and in that moment I recognized the hokiness of that, but at the same time I kind of wish, like in real life, that's what Carrie Fisher did, where we almost lost her, but then she, summoned this inner power and was able to come back to everybody, and so it was kind of it was kind of moving in that sense, So I don't know. I don't know if I have the best defenses for this movie. I think that anything you say that kind of criticizes it, I probably agree with it. But I don't know. It's this movie that is kind of. I think the core theme of it is this idea of, do we rid ourselves of the past and forge our own identity, or do we just follow the same path that everybody else has been doing? And that's definitely apparent just in the narrative of the film and where the plot beats kind of go. But I also think that that's something very precedent in just our culture in 2017. It may be silly to link, us as a people, as a society in 2017 to this Star Wars movie, but I think that that's something that we're kind of grappling with do we shed ourselves of the past, of all of these things that have got us to this point, and kind of forge on and create our own sense of identity and move forward, or do we hold on to these things that are familiar, are simple, are what we know to be true.
Now, Zach, you may have just answered this question with your last bit about the theme of the movie,
okay.
But I'm curious, having not seen the movie, it seems like more often than I've seen before, with just like mainstream just franchise studio films, I'm seeing a lot of random casual moviegoers on my Facebook feed react in very polarized ways to the movie. And I'm not talking about like Star Wars fanboys who are mad that their childhood has been ruined. This is just, average people not knowing whether they like this or not. And typically, I feel like anytime a big franchise movie like this comes out, like the new Avengers movie or whatever, people just eat it up because it's part of the franchise they like. And if it's a Marvel movie, it's a good movie if they like Marvel movies. But here, it feels like people are starting to be like very discerning, and I'm wondering like why that is. Like, why is this dividing people so much?
Yeah, I'll answer real quickly, and then I'm sure Nathan might want to add in also. I think that a lot of and I'll speak specifically at least about Star Wars and the kind of the controversy with people upset about, just the movie as a whole. I think, again, it's this idea of shedding the past. I mean, Adam Driver's character Kylo Ren specifically says that, do you want to rid yourself of the past? And this movie is obsessed with kind of taking the plot points and plot beats of just Star Wars in general and this Joseph Campbell myth making machine, and not necessarily just deconstructing it and doing something completely different. It still fits within the lines, but it's kind of refining the avenues that we usually take, and it kind of that's what kind of makes it refreshing. It's not new, but it feels new, and it's a little bit different than before. And so I think that's just a reaction people are reacting to that by, again, going, well, it worked well for the past two trilogies. This is what I know as Star Wars, and I don't like that. But Nathan, do you have anything to say about that question?
I've been trying to figure out what has upset people so much about this movie, and I can't figure it out. I legitimately don't know. And maybe part of that is just because a lot of the people who do seem very upset by it, I'm not really locked into that community. That's not kind of who I run with or who I follow on Twitter. But I do have to say, I found that this movie, I felt like it had the problem that I feel like a lot of Marvel movies have, where the villains say things, and I'm like, you know what, actually, I completely 100% agree with you. That was a big problem I had with Spider-Man Homecoming, where I'm like, Michael Keaton, like, you're making some good points here. And, like, X-Men Apocalypse, there's a scene in that movie where Apocalypse is literally like, let's get rid of all the nukes and shoot them into outer space. And then the X-Men stop him from doing that. And I'm like, why would you do that? And so, at the point in this movie where Kylo Ren is like, okay, do you want to join me and, like, shed the past and say, forget the Sith, forget the Jedi, forget the Empire, and then that doesn't really happen, I'm just like, why wouldn't you want to do that? Because I was honestly really hoping. There was a moment in this movie where, like, spoiler gong again, where Kylo is, extending his hand out to Rey and saying, join me, let's forget all this and just start something new.
But isn't he still like a allegorical Nazi? I mean, that's what Zach said at the beginning.
No, I mean, Kylo doesn't really make sense to me because he's supposed to be kind of this lone agent, but then at the end of the movie you see him, like, taking charge of this, new empire, and I'm like, this kind of like what we know about this character. I feel like he seems like somebody who would go off on his own and do his own thing.
He's an enforcer. He's not a leader. That's the sense I got.
Yeah, he seems like kind of like he wants to do his own thing. But so when he says that, like, I was kind of hoping that, like, this movie would end with, like, Luke and Leia both dying, and then, like, Kylo and Rey join together, and it's like, whoa, what the fuck? And, like, if the movie ended like that, I kind of would understand why people would be upset about it, because that's just sort of, like, traumatic. But I don't know. I was just like, I'm a little bit of a loss for why people are so upset by it. And I feel like a lot of the things that people have been praising it for, I'm kind of like, well, the prequels did that. The prequels sort of, like, deconstructed this whole mythology of, like, complicating good and evil, because I do feel like to an extent this movie does make good and evil more complicated than they were in the original trilogy. But also at the same time, I think a lot of my favorite moments in it were the moments with the old characters. And when the new trilogy started, I was like, let's just get rid of all the old stuff, let's just entirely new characters, new stories. But then I see, like, Mark Hamill in this movie, and I see Carrie Fisher, and I'm kind of like, I sort of want, which I'm sorry to bring this up again, but I sort of want, like, a Twin Peaks The Return, but Star Wars, where it's like these old characters, old icons, like, they're under the weight of this mythology, and they're sort of like, it's dealing with their age, it's dealing with what it means to be these huge cultural figures and, like, be an old person. Because I think for me, like, one of the best moments in this movie is, like, the moment that Luke and Leia have together. Like, it's just something about it is really touching to me. I mean, kind of informed too by the fact that Carrie Fisher has passed on now, but I just found something about that moment really beautiful, and I was like, I wish that along with, like, when it gets, like, the most mystical and almost psychedelic with the Force stuff, I'm like, that's what I want. I want, like, a Star Wars. A lot of people have been saying, oh, this, like, brings back the Kurosawa references and stuff. Well, I'm like, I don't want a Kurosawa movie. I want, like, a Star Wars wuxia movie where people are just like flying through the air and it's like just going out there.
What's stopping them?
Yeah,
Why not?
I don't know.
They're gonna make him till the sun explodes. You can still get your wish.
Maybe so.
Well, Star Wars: The Last Jedi, it is in theaters now. I think out of the three new Star Wars movies that have come out so far, I think we can agree that this is the best out of the three. Is that fair?
I totally agree with that.
Yeah. All right, our next film is another new release. This comes from director James Franco, as well as star of this movie. It is The Disaster Artist, and it is based on the book of the same name, and chronicles the making, or the friendship between Tommy Wiseau and Greg Sestero, who, of course, went on to iconic cult status with their 2003 film The Room, which has become this midnight movie following where people yell and laugh and throw spoons and throw footballs during the movie, and it's a whole thing. It stars James Franco. Dave Franco, James's brother, stars as Greg Sestero. It also stars Seth Rogen, Alison Brie, Zac Efron, Josh Hutcherson, and Ari Graynor. I believe most of us saw this one. I think Nathan saw it a little bit before Andrew and I. I guess first, have you guys seen The Room? And then second, if you haven't, did that affect like watching this movie at all?
Well, Nathan and I have both seen The Room. Nathan's history with The Room goes back a lot further than mine does. I watched The Room literally right before The Disaster Artist at home on YouTube, because that's the only way that you can watch this movie without buying the DVD from Tommy Wiseau's website. But Nathan, you kind of are steeped in the lore of The Room in a way, so can you give us background on what exactly this thing is?
I guess it is, sort of like one of the few true cult movies that the 21st century has produced, sort of in like a, where it has a kind of genuine interactive following like you have with Rocky Horror, but it's also informed by this kind of larger than life figure that is Tommy Wiseau, in the same way that like Ed Wood sort of hangs over Plan 9 from outer space. And a lot of it, it's the classic kind of so bad it's good, where it's just, look at somebody who made a movie that is like so sloppy and awkward, and I think a lot of it has to do too with the fact that like in Los Angeles for years after the movie, that the billboard advertising it was still up, and it's just this, if you've seen the poster, it's just this very weird picture of Tommy Wiseau in like a hideous looking font. So there was just this kind of like mystery behind it. And then the fact that Tommy Wiseau is this person with like a vaguely Eastern European accent, but he claims to be from New Orleans, and there's a lot of mystery about his backstory. It just all kind of creates, I think, this like perfect coincidence of events that came together. And I liked it, or enjoyed it, or I don't even know what words you say to like describe a relationship to that movie.
You participated in the culture of The Room.
I got something out of it when I was in high school, but as I've gotten older, The Room just makes me really sad, because it's like, this is a movie by someone who clearly has some kind of problem relating to other people, specifically women. There seems to be kind of a lot of, at worst, like lack of knowledge of how to have a relationship with women,
or just like how to pick up on social cues in general, and like how to have conversations with people.
Or at the worst, like maybe downright hatred of women.
I think that's there.
And also it's like a movie. The Room is a movie where Tommy Wiseau's character literally kills himself at the end, and I just like don't really get that much out of the experience of watching it, let alone laughing at it. It just feels like very kind of sad to me. So that's, I don't know.
It's a movie I've only found it funny like reading people's descriptions of it in retrospect, because while you're watching it, the things that are strange about it are mostly like continuity errors. Like there will be a conversation that happens and gets tape recorded, but then when the tape recording gets played back, it is a slightly different take of the conversation. And unless you're like paying very close attention, you don't notice, and it's not really like laugh out loud funny either. It's just like you said, sloppily put together. And to me, I mean, some people, and I think you've made this point in the past, Nathan, some people have praised The Room for being like this pure expression of artistic sincerity. Like the Room is this auteurist work, like every inch of it is Tommy Wiseau, and he has like no pretension about him, and like you can look at it in a very positive way that way. You can also mock him and laugh at the movie. I had a hard time doing either one of those things, just because it feels bad to laugh at him because he probably is on some sort of spectrum, and it feels bad to admire his artistry because the movie is so clearly misogynistic. I was not expecting it to be a problematic movie.
Yeah, and and the thing too about it is I feel like everybody who's not Tommy Wiseau gives a like completely sort of average, like ordinary performance. I mean, not necessarily good acting, but just acting that's just like, it's whatever. It's just like kind of shrugging my shoulders at it. It's like he is at the center of this movie and has this sort of presence that everyone else just happens to be colliding with.
Yeah. Anyways, The Disaster Artist. We now get the biopic of Tommy Wiseau, starring and directed by James Franco. Clearly, Tommy Wiseau is a very complicated issue to take on. James Franco has the task of framing Tommy Wiseau in an intentional and specific way, because there are so many different ways to look at him and so many questionable ways to look at him. And he ends up, at least my understanding of it, is taking a very simplistic, easy way out, which is the movie is a delivery system for James Franco's impression of Tommy Wiseau, which I found hilarious. I know that, again, there might be some ethical quandaries about making fun of Tommy Wiseau, but I think James Franco's impression is objectively funny, knowing how James Franco usually sounds. And even though this movie is not necessarily great, it's not saying anything particularly meaningful, it is not crafted in a particularly cinematic way, it is not bold in the way that it decides to ask us to look at Tommy Wiseau, is very funny. And I thought it was a very enjoyable movie from beginning to end. Now, I'm not coming into it with any sort of baggage about The Room, like you might have, Nathan, or concerns as to how it's going to treat that subject matter, but I found it supremely entertaining, even though, it's not going to make my top 10 of the year. I may forget about it next month. I thought it was a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I thought it was funny, and I definitely agree that James Franco's performance / impression is very good. I mean, especially when he has sunglasses on, he's really, it's hard to distinguish him from the actual Tommy Wiseau. But I feel like this movie could have had kind of a bite to it that has probably been erased just because Tommy Wiseau signed off on it.
Yeah.
And so it opens with this montage of celebrity interviews talking about how much they love The Room.
Such a weird choice.
Crazy The Room is, and how, all this stuff. And then it ends with shots of Tommy Wiseau at screenings of the movie with fans. And so it's very clearly he was very involved in it to some capacity. But I was just sort of wanting, even though I think it's funny, I was kind of hoping, I was just knowing sort of James Franco and his artistic interests and proclivities, I can imagine a version of this movie that is very dark and very fucked up and kind of dives into this almost sort of what The Master did for L. Ron Hubbard, of this kind of I don't know, maybe not, if you can't get Tommy Wiseau's approval, do sort of a loose riff on him.
Yeah.
Because Tommy Wiseau is someone who is very clearly, again, as we've said, has some serious problems with women, was also terrible to his cast and crew in numerous ways, and has these infinitely deep pockets of money, and the movie tries to depict him as this dreamer, kind of like Don Quixote, right. The man who dreamed the impossible dream to make a movie, to be a star, even though he's has a weird accent and is not the most pleasant person to look at, and he accomplished that in spite of all his odds.
Yeah.
But I just sort of feel well, not really. He had the resources to do it, and he did it, and he treated people terribly along the way. And I don't really see what there is to kind of admire in that. I do think, again, that it's pretty funny in places. I think that Zac Efron has a really fantastic cameo in it. Nathan Fielder as well. I wish there was a little bit more of them. And I also feel it's strange how little of this movie is actually the production of The Room itself. Most of it is about his friendship with Greg Sestero, played by his real life brother Dave Franco, who wears a really bad mustache and wig for some reason that I don't quite understand. And I sort of wish that the song Rhythm of the Night plays twice in this movie, which inevitably makes me think of Claire Denis' excellent Beau Travail. And I kind of wish that there was a version of this movie that was sort of like Beau Travail, where Greg Sestero represents the young, beautiful ideal that Tommy Wiseau's weird self can never be. And so it's just this kind of dark, warped obsession with Greg, and the fact that it's played by real life brothers would just make that even complicated and weirder in my mind. And so just the fact that it's kind of it's funny, but that it's very harmless and very toothless.
Yeah.
I was just sort of nah. I found it kind of forgettable.
Zach, what do you think?
The comparison I have for this movie is it reminds me a little bit of Straight Outta Compton, which came out a year or two ago, where that movie, of course, Ice Cube and Dr. Dre were very instrumental in putting that together.
Executive producers, right?
Yeah, and you have Ice Cube's son playing him and all of these different factors. And when you watch that movie, you can definitely feel them backing off the pressure on those two characters and putting much more pressure on the Eazy-E character and others, because those people are either dead or not involved in the movie, so they can kind of put more of a get more pressure and kind of dig into the dark sides of those characters, because clearly Ice Cube and Dr. Dre are just not interested in kind of exploring that. And that's kind of how The Disaster Artist felt to me. I liked it. It was enjoyable. Like Andrew said, James Franco is really funny doing this impersonation of Tommy Wiseau. But yeah, I think that there's this complicated enigma that is just kind of there, that's never really engaged with, that I think with Wiseau's approval and clear association with the movie makes it kind of impossible to really engage. I mean, they do show the quote darker side of him. There's a scene where they're shooting a sex scene between Tommy Wiseau and the Ari Grainer character, and he's just completely hateful to her, and she's naked for this sex scene, and he's just degrading her, and they have like this whole shouting match between the crew and Tommy Wiseau. But
the director, or I guess the assistant director, keeps trying to guide Tommy Wiseau to not laugh at a story about domestic abuse. And every time he laughs at it. And it doesn't make any sense why he would do it, other than he finds the suffering of women humorous. And so there are moments in the movie, like you said, that acknowledge this darker aspect of him, but it feels like it's waffling and it doesn't want to take a side.
Yeah. I don't know. It seems like I think Nathan, you described it's a little toothless, and that didn't completely deter me from liking it, because I still enjoyed it and I still laughed and thought it had its entertaining moments. But I also recognize that I think that there is this like kind of undercurrent of darkness and sadness to this movie. For my history with The Room, I was a big fan of it in high school. I actually met Tommy Wiseau and Greg Sestero at a showing at UT, and I have a picture with them. And I remember meeting Tommy Wiseau, and he was very much a strange character, just kind of babbling random words while we walked up to the stage to take the picture. And then I remember seeing Greg, and I remember kind of noticing how kind of detached he was, how he wasn't completely like against just his involvement in this whole escapade, but at the same time there's two different levels of excitement happening there, and Tommy Wiseau was way up there, and Greg was just like, yeah, let's get through this. And
Greg Sestero had just latched on to Tommy Wiseau because he had found his meal ticket, so to speak.
It seemed more like he had created this hell for himself, and he's kind of just stuck there. Like he's like, I'm unable, like I can't get out of this, so this is my life now. And
funny then that like the end of the movie is like Tommy and Greg still talk every day.
Yeah. So it seems like we're mostly in agreement. I know, Nathan, you were more negative on it, at least on Letterboxd, than Zach and I were. So any final like negative thoughts or?
Not really. I mean, no, nothing to add to others.
I know. I feel like some people on this panel may have issues with Seth Rogen. I really liked Seth Rogen in this movie. I think they got like the right amount of Seth Rogen for this. Like it was the perfect dose. It was really good. I enjoyed him.
One thing really quick, there's like the beginning of this movie, the first scene is an acting class taught by Melanie Griffith in a really weird brief appearance, and I'm kind of like, is James Franco a secret Body Double fan? I don't know.
Would not be surprised by that.
Yeah, and I think that you could further the like in that dream version of this movie that doesn't actually exist, like body, like
It's body double and Beau Travail in the room, all mixed up.
Greg Sestero is the Melanie Griffith character in Body Double.
But instead, it doesn't really feel like it has cinematic influences other than the room.
Nope.
It's just
sketch comedy.
Yeah.
Basically.
But I mean, still fun. Like, go see it. It's fun.
The Disaster Artist, it's in theaters now. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in part 2 talking about some of our first time favorites from 2017 after this. Hello, Cinematary listeners. This is Zach Dennis with an important message because I have not talked to you enough during this episode. Cinematary would like you to know that we do not want your money. We're not clamoring for your dollars. At this time, we just want to enjoy each other's company and talk about the movies and feel our, distribute our thoughts to the world and become podcasting moguls. Simple stuff. No money involved. However, there are a few things that you could do to help out the show. We would really appreciate it. The first thing is review us on iTunes. I know literally every podcast asks you this. They're like, please review us on iTunes. But it's like important because I don't know, iTunes, this is just what they do. This is how the Apple lords constrict us and keep us in their system. That's just what happens. So we need a nice little review. Just take like 2 minutes one day, be like, this is podcast review time. Put us on the list. Secondly, you can tweet us. We're at Cinematary on Twitter. Or better yet, send us an email. We're cinematary@yahoo.com so we can hear from you. If you're just like, Zach, you have terrible taste. Why do you keep talking about these superhero movies? You keep talking about these Japanese movies where all they do is drink sake and smoke cigarettes and talk about how life's awful. And I'll be like, yeah, but you're wrong. And you'll be like, yeah, but I'm just emailing you. And it'll be a whole thing. It'll be a nice discourse. Think about it. And finally, please tell your friends and family, they should know as well. I'm sure they like movies. I'm sure they like podcasts. We don't know. To recap, review on iTunes Review Day. Do that. Secondly, send your thoughts, Twitter, email, one of those. Do it. Third, share with your friends and family. We would love it. Do it. Please. Thank you. Now, let's get back to the show. And welcome back to part 2 of episode 175 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be talking about some of our first time favorites from 2017. Lydia and Nathan are going to go through theirs. We're going to do 2 each, but Lydia, go ahead and run through some of the others that you could think of that you caught this year that you really enjoy that people should check out.
I briefly wanted to shout out just Friedrich Wiseman. I definitely talked about High School on a podcast, but I also watched a bunch of his other docs, including like To Cut Follies, Primate, Basic Training. I wish I'd caught an Ex Libris, which is his newest one, but I discovered him as a filmmaker this year and like watched a bunch, and he's great. And also the Jackass trilogy, which we'll talk about later in 2018.
Am I saying mine?
Yeah.
The things that I liked. A kind of weird coincidence that happened. A lot of my like big discoveries, a lot of them all started with the letter J. So I think 2 of the big ones for me, both people who I really started exploring because unfortunately they passed away this year, Jerry Lewis, who we'll be talking about more, also in 2018, and Joseph von Sternberg, particularly his movies Anadahan, The Scarlet Empress, Shanghai Express, and The Docks of New York. Also, though, other J's, the Jackass trilogy as well. Jamal Fanaka, the great undersung LA Rebellion filmmaker of movies like The Penitentiary Trilogy and MMA. And then also I, this year, or at least started to like venture into Latin American cinema, and some of the movies that really stuck with me from that journey were the Cuban film La Última Cena, the Battle of Chile, which I've talked about on the podcast before, and the Argentinian, like 4.5 hour long radical work of cinema, The Hour of the Furnaces. Those were some of the big highlights for me for this year.
But I guess as far as actually deeply diving in, I'm gonna start with Thelma and Louise, because I remember last week I talked about 3 billboards outside of Missouri, and what I just really wanted was Frances McDormand's story and being really angry at the world and other people and taking it out in inappropriate ways. I got that. Actually, with Thelma Louise, 1991. I mean, it's Ridley Scott, and it's so easy to forget how great of a filmmaker Ridley Scott is, because lately a lot of the things he's done have not been great. But I think I'm always gonna forgive him because of Alien and Blade Runner, and now Thelma and Louise, because it's a gorgeous movie and actually really pertinent to 2017 still, sadly, I guess, and also fun. Like, Gina Davis and Susan Sarandon are really cute, and I don't know, I had fun going with them on their road.
And Brad Pitt. Oh, come on. Brad Pitt's super hot in that movie.
No, he's like young Brad Pitt, like it's like a lot happening muscle wise. I don't know. I don't know, has anybody else seen?
I know Andrew's a fan.
Oh, I mean, it was me and Jesse recommended it to you, so we were really happy that you responded so positively to it. We felt the exact same way. It's just a great, like, fist-bumping, fun, like, victorious romp of a movie.
I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily call it feminist, but it does, like, kick off. I mean, the reason they go on their tear is Gene Davis gets assaulted in a parking lot, and Susan Sarandon's character rescues her, like, murders in self-defense, and she's like, oh no one believes women when they come forward about this kind of shit, and we're just gonna be murderers and not an act of self-defense and, like, sexual assault. And just, like, in light of all of the sexual assault allegations that have come out feels like every day lately.
And Ridley Scott, bumped Kevin Spacey off his damn project and got Christopher Plummer at the last minute.
So, like, maybe it just feels a little bit good.
Yeah.
To at least see someone get some sort of comeuppance, even if it's totally movie fantasy and, like,
it's fantastical in a way that I think that people who would not align themselves with feminism would say that the film is straw manning men, and, like, every man in the movie is a absolute monster. But I don't think the movie is for that audience. I think it is meant to be, like, a very validating thing for people who are on the side of Gina Davis and Susan Sarandon, right? And why would you not call it feminist, though?
I don't know if that's Ridley Scott's thing. Like, I know Gina Davis is a very big feminist. She does the filmmakers thing down with Benton and Walmart for some reason. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
She, like, does a film. It's women in film.
At Walmart?
There's something involved. Amy Nicholson wrote an article about it.
Huh.
The Benton Film Festival. I don't know. Sorry, getting sidetracked. I mean, it's like, it's the 90s, so it's a little bit white proto-feminism. Not proto, but...
I mean, Ridley Scott has witnessed an Alien, has a kind of a fear of, potentially, of...
reproduction
and genitalia, and maybe just bodies generally, maybe not like women's bodies, but just, like, flesh and sex and all those things, so
there is that complicating it, but it's fine. I mean, also, they take down, like, just things that still happen. They take down, like, a truck driver who's, like, making obscene gestures and comments at them that they keep running into, and it's like, oh, no, women still experience catcalling or whatever the fuck. Like, sometimes you do just want to blow their vehicle up, or...
Right.
It's not a realistic act of getting back. But
it also does not offer an easy out at the end of the film. Like, they are victorious up to a point, right? And I guess people already know what the last shot of that movie is, but it's not unequivocally positive, right?
I mean, maybe there's not an unequivocally positive way to
Yeah, it's
Like-
ultimately
like
saying there's no true winning
So-
in the world that we live in, at least in the 90s and still
for
today.
women and
yeah.
still so I'm like, so I related to that too, and it was fine.
Yeah. I agree, it's super fun. I'm glad you liked it. Nathan.
So I guess the mic is passing to me, and my first film is from 1986. It is by the phenomenal, late, great Belgian filmmaker Chantal Akerman. She directed one of my favorite films of all time, Jeanne Dielman. And if you know her work, or at least some of her work, I think the works that are generally the most famous and maybe most widely screened and available, which in addition to Jeanne Dielman are movies like Hotel Monterey and News from Home, which are very personal movies, but they're also maybe a little bit slow and a little bit cold and a little bit hard for people to engage with or to get into. I mean, I think that, and this is just like me, like, you know, doing like I do, I find like Jeanne Dielman to be like one of the shortest 3.5 hour movies probably ever made, just
It's
because
really
it's like
engaging.
yeah, it's like really
For
like
some reason.
formally riveting and just kind of fascinating. And I've seen it like 3 times now, I think, and it still is just like feels very breezy to me. But for me, one of the big discoveries was her movie Golden 80s, which is basically everything that you would expect. Like, if you tried to conjure like the polar opposite of what you think Chantal Akerman is, which she has a really big filmography, and unfortunately a lot of it is like not the most widely available. And even if you can get copies or digital files or whatever, a lot of it still hasn't been restored or isn't in a great quality. But this movie is like so accessible and so fun and so colorful. It's also known as window shopping, and I think it's actually in the non-restored version. I think it's maybe like a VHS rip or something, unfortunately, is available on YouTube, but it was re-released in theaters this year in a really gorgeous 4K restoration with just like eye-popping colors. And it's a musical, and not only is it a musical, it's like a very kind of like Hollywood style musical. It's set in a shopping mall in France. You have all of these like complicated love triangles. You've got these really great pop songs. It's just like a rollicking, good, fun time. And in fact, it doesn't even like just recall Hollywood movies. Actually, 2 of the writers on it were the writers of the movie Desperately Seeking Susan with Madonna. So it does like not only like recalls that kind of spirit and mode of filmmaking, like it has that in its DNA. And one of the things that I really liked about it, one of my other favorite movies is David Byrne's True Stories, which is another, I think, underseen classic of the 1980s. And what both of these movies have in common is that they're set in, or largely set in shopping malls, or like concern kind of like commerce in the 80s in some way. But the thing is even though they have, you know, they offer some kind of critique of those systems of commerce and of capitalism, they're not like condemning it, and they're not condemning the people who work in those environments and in those systems. This movie is you know, it's recognizes these larger structures. All of the people who own businesses inside of this mall, they're constantly feeling this pressure to expand, to get larger, to get bigger. Unfortunately, that those kind of like aims at larger success don't exactly always pan out. But they're you know, the mall can sometimes be a little bit of a prison for them. For consumers, the mall can function as sort of like this shopping paradise, or even more practically sort of a refuge from the rain. There's a really great scene where it like starts raining and everybody just like comes into the mall just out of pure necessity. But at the same time, even though it may be sort of suffocating for the people who work there, it's also like allows them this space to, within the structures of capitalism, which can be so exploitative and so debilitating in many ways, it allows them to sort of create this sense of community. And it also, in just like in its color, in its music, it reminds me a lot of one of my other favorite movies from the 1980s, Francis Ford Coppola's One from the Heart, which I think is like one of the best musicals ever made. In that both of them have this really amazing sense of choreography, where choreography is used to bring people together where characters are almost like bumping into each other or not quite bumping into each other, and so you'll go from one storyline to the other just like with a gesture and like with a movement, where you have a character who's dancing and then they like pass by somebody else and you start following the character that they pass by. So it's not only is it just like super fun, super colorful, super catchy, but it also has these sort of like social, political ideas running through it, which I think is why maybe Chantal was kind of attracted to this form, just because, I mean, every Hollywood genre has at some point had some kind of critique embedded in it, even if it wasn't intentional. And so I think that's what is interesting. It uses not only the shopping mall, but it uses kind of like the Hollywood musical as this sort of space for both critique, but also for pleasure and for play, and allows itself and the audience to like recognize many of the flaws in this system without saying like you cannot enjoy this. You know, it's not condemning malls, it's not condemning musicals, it's condemning the structures that kind of lead to those things, and saying like we can create good things within these systems even if they're not desirable, even if they're not ideal. And that's just something like being someone who leans left politically and like, you know, wants to create a new system and a better world, but who also really enjoys a lot of the products of the current system. It's like that is constantly this tension of like, how do I imagine a better world? How do I imagine a better future without like, you know, but, you know, without like denying myself or feeling guilty the things that I enjoy. So to like see this sort of model created outside of Hollywood while still echoing it, I think is really, even if it's maybe not a radical necessarily movie in the way that like John Dielman is formally, I think it's maybe subversive in other ways, and it's just a damn good time. So I don't really know what the like status of the restoration is. I don't know like what the plans are for home video release. I mean, I assume because it was restored and because the restoration looks amazing that it will get like a Blu-ray or DVD release, hopefully
Please.
like in the very near future,
I really
because
want it.
like this is a movie that I just know
good.
so many people would love in the way that people love Jacques Demy's movies.
Yeah.
You know, it is like that. It is that same kind of thing where like when we did our episode on Umbrellas of Cherbourg, like, you know, we were talking about how this like recalls Hollywood movies and musicals and loves those movies and loves jazz, but at the same time it's like you have kind of little instances and references to like the conflict in Algeria and like this recognition of the outside world. So it doesn't just exist in the cloistered space of genre or of the movie. It's like recognizing the outside world. And actually the last scene of the movie is like the only scene, like at the end of the movie they go outside of the mall, and it's just this kind of like, I don't know, it's like this freeing moment of like we can play and be productive within this space, but we can also step outside of it. So Golden 80s, aka window shopping. Great.
Buy it on Blu-ray soon, I hope.
Hopefully.
Cross your fingers.
Lydia, what's your second movie?
My second movie is also a car movie, weirdly enough, road trip movie.
All the best movies are car movies.
But it's not fun.
Feel bad car movie.
It's a feel bad car movie. It was also got like a 4K restoration re-released in cinemas this year because I think it's the 40th anniversary of William Friedkin's Sorcerer. I think I watched it for the first time this year because one of my favorite critics, Mark Kermode, is always very strongly championing it and saying it was wildly misunderstood when it came out. Sorcerer is partially credited with killing the American New Wave because
it came out the same weekend as Star Wars.
Yeah, it came out
the weekend after Star Wars.
and it's got like an ambiguous title.
Yeah, and like Star Wars like such a risk or whatever, and they premiered Star Wars at Grauman's Chinese Theater, and it was like this unexpected hit, and they were like, but we have to pull it for Friedkin's new movie because The Exorcist was such a hit, and
so
then
it was in the Grauman for 1 week, and then they put Star Wars back in. And he like,
it's not a magic movie.
And people were like so pissed at Friedkin because like auteur has gone wild because he like blew a giant budget. Like the centerpiece of the film is them crossing the bridge. I should probably sum it up because I actually did not know what Sorcerer was about because
I just know a truck crosses a bridge.
a bridge, yeah. And you just said Star Wars. It's not about magic. I'm sorry. It's
Aw. But I like magic.
Sorcerer is actually what they named their truck. It's 4 men at the beginning, kind of in a very like American New Wave thing. It's like white collar, like running from white collar crime, running from some sort of like bad family situation, and they have all converged in South America. It says Nicaragua on Letterboxd. And they're like stranded there because they're criminals in their home country and they have no way of making money and they're foreigners. And so they desperately take this job of driving a truck up a mountain to get some unstable nitroglycerin to deliver it to like a mine or something, but they can't bump it because it's like volatile and could go at any moment. And so that's the reason why it's this very perilous, like mountain driving, and then the centerpiece river crossing in the storm.
How much of the movie is the bridge scene?
It's a good chunk of the middle. And I don't know if that doesn't sound appealing, but I was
so tense.
I was so
it's very
tense.
riveting.
And the most amazing thing about that is it happens twice.
Yeah.
Because there's 2 sets of like two and two in the trucks.
Oh.
And so like one makes it over. Sorry, spoilers. Ruined that.
It's a 40-year-old movie.
but then he does it again, and it's the same like really grueling sequence. And it's got the score by Tangerine Dream, which apparently freaking had like seen them performing at a church in some forest, and later they sent him tapes of music for the movie. Actually, really incredible how it all comes together and works. But I think it really does. Now it's probably not a question. Like, it's a masterpiece, and it's been
so sweaty.
It's so sweaty. Roy Schneider.
Yeah, Scheider.
Scheider. That's a different Schneider is in it. And it's like, these aren't good men, good characters. They're just really desperate, which is also something I respond to, like American New Wave films. It's not necessarily tales of good and bad. It's just bad.
That's
Yeah.
just like
It's just bad the whole time.
action out of necessity.
Yeah.
And the beginning is so weird because I remember the first time I saw it, it's like you don't really know what's going on.
And you kind of like this French Connection thing, like there's a car chase, and it's like,
And it's-
we're doing a robbery.
Jumping around like from different people in different countries, and you're just like disoriented for a while. And I mean, I'm sure that's probably why like people who saw it didn't respond to it. Because
Yeah.
they're kind of like, what's happening? And then it's like, it's
Now
really
we're in-
happening. Yeah, once you get, and you're in the trucks, it's like,
Okay.
yeah.
And they don't necessarily come together as a team either. It's not like a feel-good teamy building movie, and they learn to respect each other and get
The real sorcerer were the friends we made along the way.
The magic of friendship.
and they're like there are casualties along the way, and like the last scene, like sequence of the movie is Roy Scheider's character like, he's the last one left. His truck has broken down. He has to walk through the desert or canyons. Like, he's hallucinating. He hasn't eaten or sleep, and it's like this mystical thing happens.
Yeah.
It really, I don't know.
And Sorcerer is the name of the truck.
Yeah.
I guess we should say.
Can I ask us another spoilery question before we leave Sorcerer? Does Friedkin do a Buster Keaton in the General special effect of the truck falling down and like actually doing it?
What do you mean?
You know, there's the scene in Buster Keaton's The General where the train goes
Just
across
like
the
actually
tracks,
goes
and they
across the-
blow up the train tracks and the train falls in the river.
You get one take? No, he doesn't do that. But
okay.
The reason that it went so over budget when he was filming it was like, I think he insisted on filming in a different country and like built a bridge, and
I think
the
they might
water
have built
dropped.
The, like, oil section, because then they're like the like oil derricks or something. And
It's like, you didn't have to
fire
do
and
that.
explosions.
And then like the dry season happened and the river dropped, and he's like, well, we can't do this if there's no river to cross. So it's a little bit like Herzog-ish.
Yeah, Fitzcarraldo.
Sort of like, Jesus Christ, dude.
But actual people didn't die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you don't have to feel quite as bad watching it.
Not that feel bad of him.
Yeah. Feel bad in another way.
Nathan, what's your second movie?
So the second movie that I have is maybe like my favorite. I don't know. It's not like necessarily Discovery because I've like known about it for a little bit and been meaning to watch it for a while, but just like the movie. I think maybe the old movie that I saw for the first time this year that just like shook me to my core, and that is Choi Huck's Dangerous Encounters of the First Kind, also known as Don't Play with Fire, which is a movie from Hong Kong from 1980. If you know anything about Choi Huck, he is regularly called the Steven Spielberg of Hong Kong. His debut feature was in 1979, and since then he's been involved in like honestly probably over 100, maybe even over 200 movies in various capacities as a director, as a producer, writer, actor, like literally everything. And he is kind of like Steven Spielberg and also like George Lucas, sort of this figure that represents a big change in Hong Kong cinema on a number of levels, both in like the types of movies that were made, in how business was done. He brought like American level special effects to Hong Kong. He produced the first CGI animated feature in Hong Kong in 1997. He worked in Hollywood. He did a few Jean-Claude Van Damme movies in the late 90s. Including Double Team with Dennis Rodman. And he's still working today, although he has been, since Hong Kong cinema has kind of subsided in the last 20 years and been taken over by this like state-sanctioned Chinese cinema. And so he's working in that system now and doesn't really have necessarily the creative freedom that he did in Hong Kong. But his works are, his movies now are still pretty solid too. But the interesting thing about him is, I think even though people call him the Steven Spielberg of Hong Kong, I think the comparison to George Lucas may be a little more maybe a more effective parallel, because like George Lucas, his first few movies were much more radical and much more political, at least explicitly, than his later work. And then after kind of the failure of his first few movies, he made Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain in 1982, which has these kind of like Star Wars level special effects and was a big hit. And from then on out, he's just been kind of a like, even though his movies are still fantastic, they're still subversive, they're still breaking and creating new trends, they are like very much kind of mainstream Hong Kong cinema. But the interesting thing about Dangerous Encounters of the First Kind is, for me, being somebody who's been really into Hong Kong cinema for a while, is that it is like the most explicitly anti-colonial movie I've ever seen from Hong Kong. And I guess maybe your mileage with this movie might vary, considering like based on how much you know about Hong Kong history. If you don't know much about Hong Kong history, Hong Kong was a British colony until 1997. And it exists a little bit differently from a lot of other colonies and British colonies kind of throughout the history of the British Empire, in that Hong Kong didn't really exist much as a city or as a place until colonialism. So colonialism is wrapped up in its history. It didn't really have a history before the British kind of announced themselves there. But this movie is just like, it's just like a knife in the eyeball. It's about these three teenagers who are just messing around, and they're living in this city that's cramped, that's crowded, where the conditions are not the best, where they don't really have things afforded to them. And they, just for fun, they build a bomb, which is, the title sounds like a riff on Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I don't know what the exact Cantonese translation is, and I have a feeling that maybe that title was like kind of directed at an English-speaking audience, because the first kind is in reference to like the category of bombs, like in the illegal weapons classification in Hong Kong. So like a bomb is like an illegal weapon of the first kind. So these three teenagers build this bomb and they set it off in a movie theater, And they don't really have any aims. There's like no intent to their action. They're just kind of like doing it for fun and because they're frustrated teenage boys. But there's this girl who goes to school with them who's like kind of psychotic, and she like tortures rats for fun, and like there's a really gruesome scene where she like throws a cat out of a window and it like lands in barbed wire, and it's just like she has some issues, but this bomb attracts her attention, and so she kind of like takes these boys under her wing, and they just go crazy. They like stage a bank robbery. They're just like doing all kinds of fuck shit, but it starts to attract the attention of this like blank-faced American soldier who is just not having it. And so the rest of the movie is kind of like this fight between them and this American soldier. And it's a really interesting movie because it was so kind of politically forward and radical. It was really censored by officials, and so the version of it that I have and that's also available on YouTube, it goes back and forth between like standard quality and then like scenes that were cut from the original release that were available on VHS and have been restored. So it will like go back and forth between normal quality and VHS, sometimes from like shot to shot. But most of the movie is like a normal, palatable quality. But for some reason that just like makes it more interesting that it's like this kind of like butchered thing that has been put back together. And I don't know, it's like looking at movies from Hong Kong in terms of Hong Kong history is always interesting, just because Hong Kong never really had an alternative cinema. There was no art house cinema, there was no experimental or real like independent cinema. So if artists like wanted to put kind of subversive messages in their movie, they had to figure out how to smuggle it into a studio industrial product. And this movie like is a studio movie, but it's also like it's very different. It's just like it's very angry. It's kind of like a bomb under your seat. It's just like at the edge. It's just mad. It's like not having it anymore. At the end of the movie, one of the protagonists is literally like firing a machine gun into the camera, and then you see these black and white images flash from the 1967 riots in Hong Kong. There's a scene where the three teenage boys with their shirts off are giving a middle finger to this American soldier, but the American soldier is like not in the frame, so they're giving a middle finger to the audience. And that's just what it feels like. It's just this like very angry, volatile bomb of a movie that is just exploding at the edges. And it's like, and it's then really interesting to go on to Choi Huk's other works, which again, there's like a lot of masterpieces there. One of my other favorite movies from this year was Green Snake, which is from like 1993. It has Maggie Cheung. It's just this like beautiful psychedelic movie, very much in the wuxia genre, even if it's subverting it. But this is just like something else. It's explicitly radical, and I don't know. It's like, but it also at the same time it works really well as a thriller. A lot of the soundtrack of it is directly lifted from Dawn of the Dead, and I think there's kind of a really good parallel to that movie, and that both Dawn of the Dead and Dangerous Encounters function as just like straight up thrillers. You can not give a shit about politics and really like those movies just as like tight, thrilling genre movies. But then you have that subtext, and you have, you know, in Dawn of the Dead you have that kind of like critique of capitalism and of consumerism, and in Dangerous Encounter you have that critique of colonialism and of like an assertion of Hong Kong's own identity apart from the United Kingdom and apart from mainland China too. Just that like this is a place and these are people who deserve to be recognized. They have been kind of forced into these cramped conditions, like the rats that get tortured, and so I don't know. It's like I also think too there were a lot of comparisons made between Dawn of the Dead and Nocturama, which is one of my favorite movies of this year. And I think if you really liked Nocturama, you might like this as well. Both are about teenage terrorists who have all this like anger and aggression out the outside world, and they don't exactly know how to channel it just because the system that they live in hasn't really taught them like what to do with it. They haven't been given anything. So I don't know. That's just me rambling about Dangerous Encounters of the First Kind in Hong Kong cinema.
Somehow sounds like a good thing, because Golden 80s is malls, Dawn of the Dead, not
yeah. I just
so like
all my favorite movies are about malls, and there are no mall scenes in Dangerous Encounters, but it does have that weird communion with Dawn of the Dead and Nocturama.
So.
Yeah, I don't know. It's so good. Like if you can set aside the kind of minor quality issues with the version that's on YouTube, like I really recommend watching it.
All right. Well, I believe that will wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter at Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we post all the movies that we talked about in this episode. Next week, we will be continuing our first our
favorites.
First time favorites. I blanked for a second. First time favorites of 2017. Andrew and I will be going over ours. But until then, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.